recording now and introduce Lourdes Aviles, who is joining us this evening from her space at PSU, where she is a meteorology professor, among many other things. And Lourdes, I will let you introduce yourself a little bit, and we are so happy that you're joining us this evening, and welcome to everybody who is on. We're so looking forward to your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. By the way, did you start the recording? Because it didn't
I
give the notification.
did. You were good.
Oh, it does say it. All right. So let me share my screen so that I can have my title slide while we get started. And it will take a second to load. So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for having me tonight. I was happy to step in last minute to cover for somebody that could not be with you tonight. So I thank you very much for being here. As Leah said, my name is Lourdes Aviles, and I am a professor of meteorology at Plymouth State University. I chair the meteorology program and the new climate studies program that will start accepting students for next year, among other hats. So tonight, I would like to talk to you about the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. I like to say that that is the one to which all other New England hurricanes are sooner or later compared. And back in 2004, when I started teaching here, one of my students did a research project on flooding in the Pemi River. And that was the first time I was aware of this hurricane. And a few years later, I decided to start looking into it. And I found so much that I have material here to speak for probably 5 hours, if you'll have me. I will try to do a lot less than that. So what I like to do is I like to study the science of meteorological phenomena, of course, but I also like to study its interdisciplinary connections with other sciences like the hydrology, the geology, the forest ecology in this case, societal connections, the history, the historical times that everything that was happening there, or the history of our knowledge about hurricanes. So I like to kind of interweave everything related to the story of in this case, the New England hurricane. Um, so today I will tell you a little bit about the storm's history. I will give you a little bit about hurricane science and a little bit of behind the scenes. As I said, I have way much more than I can tell you about tonight. And that's why I ended up putting it all in a book, um, which was published a few years ago. That's the cover there, right on the right side. And the other picture is an excerpt from this map, which is a daily weather map that was published by what was called then the Weather Bureau, which is the National Weather Service, which was a summary of the weather for every single day. And they have been publishing that since 1871, and they still do it. So this was the day of the hurricane. Oops, there you go. And you can see the hurricane early in the day, areas that receive precipitation. There's a summary of weather. There's all sorts of observations on the right. There's a forecast for that day. So obviously they published this afterward, but they gathered all the information so that they could have it in one place. So this was a Wednesday, September 21st, 1938. Everybody was preoccupied with the political situation in Europe. As you might know, exactly or almost exactly a year later, World War II started. But the political events that led to it were already happening in 1938. So if there would have been 24-hour cable news back then, they would have been talking about the political situation in Europe. This is New England, so a lot of people spent their summers here. There was no air conditioning back then, so they wanted to spend their summer in nicer weather in lakeside and beachside and mountainside And but this was after most summer dwellers were gone, so people went about their business. It had been very rainy for the past week or so, after also a very rainy summer, and people woke up to sunny skies. Some did not have sun; it was probably cloudy, but no rain. So a lot of them took advantage and went to do their errands, uh, taking advantage of no rain. Something I forgot to mention is that that forecast for the day did mention that later in the day there would be rain, maybe heavy rain, and that it would turn colder later, which would have been the passage of a cold front as we understand it today, but they didn't call them that back then yet. So they were not really aware that a hurricane was coming. The picture on the previous slide is Main Street in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. So this is how I was looking with the surge, the waves around the time of the hurricane. I don't have the information if it was during or after or before. Um, so little did they know that before the day was over, hundreds would be dead. They would live through the costliest storm of all time by then. Since then, there have been others. The damages, if you convert them to 2020 dollars, were $5 to $9 billion. And the devastation was widespread. Everywhere in New England, Long Island, received some kind of damage. We're talking about buildings, we're talking about the forest, we're talking about roads. It was a once in a century or two storm for New England. The picture in the previous slide is in Ware, Massachusetts. And if you notice here, there's a bridge and there's a missing bridge right there. Thousands of bridges and roads were washed out, and as well as other structures. So I want to go back to the very beginning of this storm and give you the, if you will, the life history of the storm. And then as we hit a few steps, I will tell you a little bit about the science or the history. So it formed, well, it formed on the eastern side of the Atlantic, but the first sign of it was some disturbed weather over Africa in the southern part of the Sahara Desert. These are called easterly waves, and they are a very common source for Atlantic hurricanes. And they move from east to west, and then when they come over the ocean, they develop a circulation and they can turn into a hurricane. And that's what happened with this one. Something we need to understand, though, is that we didn't have satellites back then. In fact, we only started having satellites in 1960, and it took until 1980 to have full global coverage. So most of these observations that I'm telling you about were made afterward, when people then dug out what was happening and they figured out where the storm must have come from. The animation is Hurricane Bill in 2009, which is a good example of more or less how this storm would have looked like if we could have seen it in satellite. There it comes again. So it would have been coming from the east, from Africa, moving northwest, and getting more and more organized into a hurricane. The first observation that we had of this storm was about 2 weeks later, on September 16th, and it was done by a Brazilian cargo ship called the the SS Alegrete, which was a cargo ship that had a very interesting story of its own. It was sized during World War I, and it was sunk during World War II accidentally by friendly fire. So that was the first observation when the storm was already a full-fledged hurricane and about to turn into a major hurricane. Before that, we had no idea that this monster was coming. So a lot of the observations we have are from ships, and it's amazing the amount of information we can get from ship observations. We can figure out, just from having the wind direction and the wind speed, we can figure out the position, the central pressure, the wind direction, and where the ship was potentially respect to the center of the hurricane. So it was 1938, and we didn't have all these aids like computers and satellites, but it was amazing how much you could learn from a storm. So that image there is from the observations of the Alegrete. I figured out where in the storm the ship was. And it was likely, if this is the eye of the hurricane, that the ship was moving through the northern part of the eye wall, given the observations. Now, the problem with ship observations is that once they start sharing that there's a hurricane, obviously other ships are going to get out of the way. None of the ships had any kind of commitment to provide observations to the Weather Bureau. So the more information you get, the less observations you start getting. So after knowing very well where the storm was at first, then you start getting a lot more uncertainty because you don't get many observations. It makes sense, right? You get out of the way. Back in 1938, there was no National Hurricane Center. That came in 1955. And what they had was this system where, depending on where the storm was the the Weather Bureau office that took care of it. So our storm, when we first got observations, was right here in the middle of the Atlantic, and that was in the Jacksonville, Florida area. So the forecasters in Florida were the ones that started doing observations, warnings, and things like that. And of course, Florida has a lot of experience with hurricanes. So it appeared that the storm was going to go straight for Florida. It was intensifying. It was already a major hurricane. And this is our friend Hurricane Bill from 2009. This is more or less how the storm might have looked back then. So advisories for Florida were put out. People took it very seriously because just 3 years earlier, the most intense hurricane to have ever made landfall in U.S. territory was the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. And to this day, that is still the most intense hurricane at landfall. So there was a lot of devastation that came with that. There were a lot of deaths, especially World War I veterans. So Florida took it seriously. You know, they put up their storm shutters, all sorts of information over the radio, over loudspeakers. But then it became obvious that the storm was turning. And what they saw, again, you can't see the storm. We don't have satellite. So what they would see is that the pressure was not coming down as fast as you would think if the storm was coming. So there are two options. One, the storm is weakening, or two, the storm is turning away from you. And they understood hurricane science enough to know that it was likely that this storm was turning away, which is called recurving. So this hurricane was recurving, and this is very common for it to happen with Atlantic hurricanes. The peak of the hurricane strength was near the Bahamas as a Category 5 with 160 miles an hour. So this is one of the biggest hurricanes in the Bahamas as well as New England. This is a little snippet that I like to show from the New York Times. It's from September 20th. So this is the day before, as the hurricane was already known that it was not going to come into Florida. And they're talking about thousands of relief residents. They're thinking of this faraway hurricane. And they're also talking about the predicted gradual turn toward the North Atlantic, and that it might just be a concern for the transatlantic ships. So they were expecting that this hurricane would do what they normally do, which is recurve into the North Atlantic. like our friend Hurricane Bill of 2009. So the storm did its thing, it recurved, and then it crossed the magical line of 35 north that passed it from Jacksonville, Florida to the Washington, D.C. National Weather Bureau office, which was the headquarters office. And this office had the headquarter offices. It had the most recognized forecaster in the nation, and it had a good army of weather map analysis people. You can see there, this picture is from a few years before the hurricane. You can see the architect tables, and they were all in their suits. They were all guys as well. And they would provide the information to the lead forecaster who made all decisions. And everybody agreed that, or they probably didn't even discuss it, but they believed that hurricanes avoid New England. There was no threat to New England. The storm would turn like they always do. So the question is, and I could give a whole talk about what happened at the Washington Weather Bureau office, but in the name of time, we're going to move forward. So why would hurricanes avoid New England? And one reason is because the winds, the normal winds around planet Earth, this is the way in which they move. The Bermuda High is in the middle of the Atlantic, and there is a clockwise flow around it that steers hurricanes in this form. Sometimes they steer them to move to turn faster. Sometimes the steering is a little weaker, and then they don't turn and go into Florida or the Gulf. So hurricanes coming toward New England are very rare. Not only that, but when they do come, the other image here is sea surface temperature. You might be aware of the Gulf current, which is a warm current of water. The, the water around New England is much, much colder. So if a hurricane did not turn and came toward New England, normally it was much weaker. And it was more like when a nor'easter comes, which, can cause a lot of bad weather, but is not like a hurricane. And there's another interesting detail, which is that since the creation of the agency that became the Weather Bureau and is now the National Hurricane Center, there have been about 70 years. It was created in 1870. And the last Category 3 hurricane to hit New England was in 1869. So you could have worked for the for the Weather Service for 70 years and have never ever seen a hurricane, a full-fledged major hurricane hit New England. So we cannot really blame them for not really recognizing that the storm was coming, but it was coming. And this is an image that shows you, I put an arrow there to show you what the jet stream was doing. The jet stream was very curved and very straight toward New England. So when the storm came, it was steered northward directly toward New England, which is not what they normally do. They go this way. So not only that, but that flow was very strong. So when the hurricane came, it was steered very, very fast toward New England. And that's why you might have heard that some people call this hurricane the Long Island Express, because it was fast as a train. That is not my preferred name. My preferred name is the Great New England Hurricane. But the reason for the Long Island Express nickname is because it was moving so fast. So there were no hurricane warnings. At some point, there was what they called a northeast storm warning. Those don't exist anymore, but it's what they would do when there was a nor'easter coming. It was coming too fast. They didn't know it was coming. Even if they knew, they probably didn't know how fast it was coming. So it was highly unlikely that they would have been able to warn that this hurricane was coming toward people. These flags, this is the flags that signify a hurricane. So hurricane warning is two red flags with a black flag in the middle. There were not any of those when the hurricane came. So the hurricane did come. It made landfall in Long Island in the afternoon at 2:45 with winds of 120 miles an hour, which is Category 3 winds. It crossed Long Island. It went through the Long Island Sound, and it made landfall in Connecticut, New Haven, about an hour later, with the wind still very strong, 115 miles an hour. The timing of the landfall was problematic, and you wouldn't realize this. First of all, as I said already, it made landfall with the strength of a Category 3. So it caused Category 3 strength damages, such as, winds and storm surge and everything that comes with those. But the storm was also transitioning into what we call an extratropical cyclone. And even though those extratropical cyclones tend to be weaker, they are very, very large. So it was still strong enough, and the area that was being affected was much larger than for a normal hurricane. So a much larger area was affected by the rain and by winds that were still strong enough. So the worst of both worlds. So this is an image from a National Geographic article that was published a year later in 1939. And I like it because it kind of gives the impression and the idea, the correct idea, that the entire New England region and Long Island were affected by this. So you can see here Long Island, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Here's New Hampshire, a little tilted, and Vermont, and parts of Maine. All that region, and also Quebec. All that region was affected by the New England hurricane. So when the storm came, people didn't know what it was. They just knew it was raining and windy and bad weather. And it took a little bit for them to realize how bad it was. A lot of people were caught outside. That picture is from Manhattan. And, there were upside down umbrellas, people running into stores to take cover. The ones that were on the shore saw what looked like a fog coming, and it was really the storm surge. It was a wall of water that was coming. The wind eventually became deafening because 100-mile-an-hour winds plus sounds very scary. And lots of roofs got damaged. Steeples of churches got a lot of damage. And the wall of water that came just flooded everything, and not everybody was able to run away and survive it. Some people at first, when the water started coming in, their instinct was to save, whatever it was, their office or their store, to try to shut the windows and close things to save their stock. So here's a couple of pictures of steeples. I like to joke, but maybe not very appropriately, that going to church during the storm was the wrong thing to do, because so many steeples were broken and fallen, some of them right through the roof. And in fact, you can, if you drive around, a lot of times in the vestibule of churches, there's pictures of the damage that the storm caused, including many steeples. So the exact types of damages depended on where you were. On the coast, you got the Category 3 major hurricane damage. You got the wind damage from the excessive winds. You got the wall of water, the storm surge that caused, flooding, caused structural damage. It damaged crops. It killed livestock. And this is where most of the fatalities due to the storm occur. People drowned in the wall of water that came with the storm, and they didn't know it was coming. So there were hundreds that died that way, and some others that died at sea in their ships and boats. So this was mostly in Long Island and southern New England. Rhode Island had the largest number of deaths. In interior New England, there were deaths as well, but the damages had to do more with inland flooding, rivers and lakes, landslides, and the massive tree damage that came with the storm. And then everywhere you had roads, bridges, dams, railroads, power lines, the shade trees in the towns. All those things were knocked down, and that happened everywhere in Long Island, southern and northern New England. Here is an example from Napatree Point in Rhode Island. So this is how it looked before the storm, and this is how it looked after the storm, because the storm surge pretty much washed everything out. If you see here, this little area with I can't tell exactly what it is, some kind of wall or pier is right here as well, but the buildings are missing. And I found a lot of poetic descriptions saying that the storm surge had brought the beaches back to their pristine state. However, that's not quite true, because all this would have been debris back here. So it was just a shocking disappearance of all the structures that were right on the shore. This is from Providence. Providence in areas had 25 feet of flooding. This is after the storm settled down, but the flooding was still there. You can see all the cars. I found some accounts of horns that got shorted sounding, and you can imagine the horns and the wind, and there would have been all sorts of very high waves in here as well. So it must have been really scary. In like around Canal Street in Rhode Island, there's a little area by the canal on the side of an old market house from the 1700s, which is now owned by the Rhode Island School of Design, where there was this plaque from the previous hurricane that had flooded the city in 1815, and they marked the water height. So they immediately put up another plaque showing that this was 13 feet and 9 inches above the mean water tide for the canal that went through that street. And there is a plaque there. And my husband and I went hunting for it a few years ago. We had a wedding to attend, so we spent time trying to figure out what building this was, and we actually found the plaque and took some pictures. Since then, in the 1960s, Rhode Island, not Rhode Island specifically, but the Providence has built a sort of dam wall. I think it's called a Fox Point hurricane barrier, with these floodgates that can be open or closed. But there has been no major hurricane coming since then. The Hurricane Carol in 1954 happened before. It was not as bad as the New England hurricane, but it was as bad for Providence. It was just very small, like a normal major hurricane is. So the hurricane barrier is there, but there has been no chance to test it since then, I would say, thankfully. So one of the things that this hurricane did a lot was that it damaged the barrier islands that line most of southern New England and the southern part of Rhode Island. This is a big example, the Shinnecock Inlet. I put the map here. It's in the Hamptons. So that was broken by the hurricane. And there were many breaks that kind of healed themselves, because those barrier islands are very dynamic. But people continued maintaining this because it allows them to cross from the bay side to the ocean side in their boats. And it's been controversial, and some people want to close and others want to keep it open. But the Great New England Hurricane did that. And even the areas that did not get a direct hit, like this is the southern part of Manhattan, the Battery Park, which was on the milder side of the storm. These are waves that were like 20, 30 feet high happening. And this was the good part of the storm. This was not the bad part of the storm. The force of the water was so huge that it literally shook the ground, and seismographs around the region were showing shaking that was due to the storm. So this was in New York City at Fordham University. They had a seismograph, and apparently the shake of the ground was felt as far away as Alaska. Some houses were taken off their foundation. Some, turned into splinters, while others were carried. There's some stories about houses, entire houses that came off the northern part of Long Island and sailed and crossed the Long Island Sound, and families were able to ride their houses to the other side. There's also a lot of people that did not survive this, and you know uh, there were people floating in the water together with pieces of wood. There are several books out there that focus on witness accounts. This Sudden Sea one is the one that is the most popular, that a lot of people have read, from about 20 years ago. And this one was the first one that was published of this kind. Wind to shake the world refers to that shaking of the ground caused by the storm. So what I did is that I did not focus on the witness accounts. Well, I used them to inform my understanding of the effects of the storm. So my book focused on the science and the history, and a lot less on witness accounts. So the storm came into interior New England that evening between 6 and 7 p.m. There are a lot of accounts of the storm. And historical societies, all these towns and libraries, you can find books that all have a page or two on the 1938 hurricane. So it's interesting to read the accounts that talk, all of them talk about deafening wind and the noise that the trees made as they fell. So it was a very stormy evening, but it happened very fast because the storm was moving so fast. Another problem was the amount of rain, as I mentioned before. This was a little diagram that I put together. I put in the first edition of the book, and between the hurricane and the rain that had fallen in the previous days, it was a huge amount of rain, like with observations of more than 17 inches. Like half an inch of rain is already a lot of rain. 1, 2, 3, 4 inches of rain is a huge amount of rain. So 15, 17 inches is just unthinkable. And since after the first edition of the book, we got hold of a book that had hundreds of rain observations throughout the region, and a student of mine put together this map showing the area that had 1 inch. The entire region had at least 1 inch of rain, and then you had areas up to and more than 15. So everything was drenched with rain, which caused all the river flooding. The trees, there was a massive tree breaking and blowdown. The Forest Service estimated 5 billion board feet of tinder, and a board foot is a square of 1 inch thick and a foot by a foot. So the way in which the tree damage was assessed back in 1938 was looking into what wood you could salvage from it. I did some dirty calculations, imagining 10-foot trees with 10-inch diameters, and estimated that the number of fallen trees was from tens to hundreds of millions of trees. There was 15 million acres that were damaged, where the trees were fallen, broken, or bent. And the whole thing was followed by a massive salvage operation. The entire state of New Hampshire was a tangled mess of trees. The southwest part of the state, especially Keene, had a lot of white pine damage. So the Forest Service put together a commission to do an assessment of the tree damage. And here is a little excerpt of the map. And you can see that New Hampshire is pretty covered with tree damage, and so is parts of Vermont, Maine, and it continues down into Massachusetts. Now you see this area here that might seem like it has less damage. That corresponds very well with the White Mountains, especially the Presidential Range. And it was not that there was no damage, is that they were not allowed to do tree salvage in there, so they didn't even bother assessing the tree damage in that area. A lot of the softwoods were put in lakes to store them, to keep them from the elements and from insects. And Turkey Pond in Concord had a lot of trees just floating like that. Turkey Pond is a little to the southwest of Concord, so I marked the pond here. And there's all sorts of stories about the wood and how long it took to process the wood. In fact, there's a book out there written by somebody named Stephen Long, who is 38, the hurricane that transformed New England, who focuses mostly into the forest damage done by this storm because it was that massive and that huge. In fact, he came to visit me as when he was writing his book, right after I had published mine. And he asked me some questions about meteorology. He had a chapter on the meteorology, and the rest of the book was about the forest. And I had a chapter about the forest, so we kind of exchanged some information. So he was very kind to push my book in his book. But he also made me a character in his book, like somebody he talked to as he was trying to untangle a hurricane story. And he was talking about the trinkets I have here in my office. And the funny thing, what was it? He said, oops, I went. Yeah, I can't see it there, but somewhere he said that you knew you are not in the office of a stuffy academic. So I guess I appreciate that. So getting back to the rain, it had been raining for a long time. Many of the rivers were already near flooding or were already flooding. I found that 500-page report from the Geological Service that had river heights and rain. So this graph was made with the graph in the background I'll show again in a moment, was made with that data. And a student of mine put together this other graph that has the river flow in the Connecticut River, starting from the northern part of the river to the southern part of the river, and you get peaks in flow that are higher and higher, and later and later and later as the water moves down the river. So this image I showed just now is from the Pemmy River here in Plymouth. There's a USGS station that has been in place since 1903. So if you make a line when the hurricane arrived, it was already pretty flooded because it had rained so much. And this is when the hurricane left. And then it took more than a week for the waters to subside. So I went, this is about 10 years ago, I went with my kids to check it out. And my husband too was somewhere in there, but somehow he didn't get in the picture. So you can tell that one of them was very eager to pose for me, while the other one, not so much. So here's Chris, who's now in college, posing for me. This is the USGS station, and this is how high the water went. The bottom of this is about 17 feet from the bottom of the river, and the water was as high as 23 feet and 23.6 feet. So that was how bad the flooding was in Plymouth. And some of you that might have gotten gas on exit 25, you might have seen this Citgo gas station has some odd markings on the wall. What it was is that for the longest time they were marking the water height every single time that that gas station flooded. It is on the floodplain of the Pemi River. And the highest one was in 1987. My thing is kind of in the way, so I cannot read it. But the 1938 hurricane came at a time when this gas station did not exist, but the mark would have been a brick above the highest. So, oops, there I am. This was right after Hurricane Irene, and I thought I was pointing at Irene, but I was totally failing. Here's Irene, the mark for Irene. So Hurricane Irene, which flooded this entire area, exit 25, and everything in the floodplain, fell way short. By the way, the highest river level here was from the 1936 flood, which was due to snowmelts and ice jams, and it was 3 feet higher. So it goes above this. So the storm dissipated over Canada. After it went through New England, it was kind of slowing down. It was just sputtering a couple more inches of rain, and it dissipated over Quebec. And so this whole thing happened in half a day, less than half a day. Here in New Hampshire, there were 12 deaths. The damages were about 200 million, and it was just a tangled mess everywhere with the trees. The notches were closed. Tourism was affected. There was no hiking. There was no hunting. There was extreme fire damage from all the fallen wood and dried wood and dried trees. So it was shocking. If you're in New Hampshire, you look outside and there's trees everywhere. Well, imagine all those fallen. A while ago, I was able to go and examine the observations at my Washington Observatory, and they had a note there the day after the hurricane talking about violent winds continuing throughout the night, trees blown down on all sides of the mountain. They were talking about the railroad, the carriage road is closed by fallen trees. This would have been what is the outer road now. And the trestle, the railroad trestle, this thing, which is the area that is called Jacob's Ladder, very steep and big trestle that pushes the cog railway, was destroyed. And it was destroyed right under the skyline, is what they were saying, right here. And very recently, I had a chance to, when my kid worked for one of the tourism places a few years ago, we got free tickets to the cog railway. And I was shocked when they said that the wood that you could see on the ground was from the 1938 hurricane. They rebuilt, but they didn't clean up. So I was all excited taking pictures of everything I could see out the window. So what was left behind was just unimaginable devastation. Unimaginable even to me, who have spent so much time looking at information about the storm. There was a massive relief operation that had never happened before. Anywhere from the federal government, the state, the police, the Coast Guard, even the Boy Scouts and church groups and neighbors were all involved in cleaning up and helping each other. This would never happen today because people would have had to evacuate for their own safety. But this is what happened back then because everybody was in their houses when the storm came. And another thing is that, I don't know if you're paying attention to the date, but that was September 21st. So in only a couple of weeks later, we were supposed to have the magnificent New England fall colors. And that year, it didn't come. Everybody spoke of, all the written reports I saw, of winter-like conditions happening from one to the next day, which was a little dramatic, but it just showed how the trees were bare. And I'm sure it was colored in some bushes, but it was shocking. You know, the tangle of trees, no colors, roads washed out, something like we never imagined can happen here. And there's a lot more. There was scientific understanding that we had from this storm. Hundreds, thousands of documents and accounts and memorabilia and poems and novels that used the storm. Um, there was a musical for the 250th anniversary of Plymouth, and there were other towns that were also having their 250th anniversary. And there was a whole number about the hurricane in this show, which I was very surprised and happy to see. Those of you that have been at the Flume, the Flume covered bridge, this guy here, the tree that serves as its foundation, was a gigantic 100-foot plus tree that was 5 feet in diameter that was knocked down for the storm, and its wood was used for the bridge. I have found discs of wood fallen from the hurricane that were chopped, and a brass plate was put on them by the city of Hartford. And I still haven't figured out if they sold them or gave them away, but I've been buying any of these that I find on eBay. So people started bringing me chairs to these talks, and I learned that there was a company in Massachusetts that was making chairs with wood fallen from the hurricane, with pine. So I found myself one of them. It was a little kitty rocking chair that had exactly the same markings on the bottom, and now I can recognize them without, I look at the chair and I know it is without seeing the writing. I found scrapbooks with poems and drawings from kids and songs. People sent to me pictures of different things associated with the storm. These are kids playing on the trees. And I know that I need to stop soon so that we don't go too late. But the question is, can this happen again? The simple answer is yes, definitely. But for a storm to be this strong and this widespread devastation, the frequency is very small. It happens roughly every 150 years, but that's an average, so it doesn't happen too often. And seeing geologic evidence back 1,000 years, we can detect 6 of them. So it's not something you expect to happen every day, but it can definitely happen again. And we can get other hurricanes that are not as devastating, like we did with Irene. So those are the 3 big ones since historical time: 1938, 1815, and 1635. So when it happens again, which hopefully will not be too soon, the good news is that we will have much better communication, much better forecasting. It's not going to take us by surprise, so people will be able to evacuate. The bad news is that it will happen again, and we have more trees now, we have more infrastructure, we have more people living in the coast. So it will likely be a lot less deadly, but also a lot more expensive. But, we might be dead for 100 years before this happens again. So this is not to scare anybody. So I'm going to jump to the end. I have reviewed many, many documents. It's all in this book that I was lucky to publish with the American Meteorological Society. And this is a quote from the book of how everything ends, but instead of reading it, I am going to end here, and I will get off the PowerPoint and stop my share so that I can answer any questions that anyone might have.
That was
Excellent.
really interesting. Is global warming increasing this type of weather event?
So, because these are so far apart, I would say that uh, the effects are more on the effects, if that makes any sense. If one of these storms came, it wouldn't necessarily be stronger, but its effect would be worse because the sea level is higher, for example. So in areas that are not used to receiving these storm surges would be receiving the storm surge. Climate change will also cause changes in the patterns of where the storms form. So some regions might experience less, others might experience more. Climate change is also heating the ocean, which is the fuel for the storm, so can potentially make them stronger. And climate change also is increasing what we call wind shear, which does not help hurricane formation. So the science of hurricanes still is possible that we will have less hurricanes, but stronger, the ones that that form. But that's still a lot of
Speculation.
yeah. We need to do more assessment. We have already seen that it seems like hurricane category 5 hurricanes have been happening more and more often when you look
Okay.
at the data. But the things that we know for sure is atmosphere is warming, ocean is warming. The specific effects on hurricanes, it depends which effect is stronger.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much, Lourdes. We have a number of folks online here tonight, and I know that there are probably a lot of questions. So we'll do our best to get to a few right now, and then we'll check back in a few minutes. So I see either a hand up. Feel free to type in the chat bar. Let's see. Right now, I just saw Al Zelbo, and he's already unmuted. So there you go, Al. It's you. Oh, now we're muted.
Yeah, a little bit of editorial comment or add something to this. Generally speaking, you think of hurricane as wind. The biggest damage from this really was the water.
Mhm.
And it's a very interesting storm in a way, in that Providence, which suffered enormous damage, the water came in from the south. It was pushed up the bay narrows down, and it continued to rise as it gets squeezed down like Bangladesh. So that's why they have the mitigating gates at the moment, which they've never used. On the other hand, the rest of New England, the water came downward, not from the south. It came basically downward, flowing down from the north. Now, number 5 on that list of where the river rose was the Vernon Dam. I worked at the Vernon Dam in the late 50s for about 3 years. And it had all been repaired at that time. By that time, and generation was functioning and back to normal. But what I still remember very clearly, because it was astounding to me, that the walls at the dam in the generation portion, they weren't 6 inches wide, they weren't a foot wide. These were cement walls that were several feet thick. And you could see where they were repaired. You could see where they had to be rebuilt. The height the water came up, the force of the water taking out walls that were several feet thick of concrete. It was just astounding to understand the force of what was taking place at that time. And up in Brattleboro, you had the West River, the Whetstone Brook. It took out the bridges between Vermont and New Hampshire, and they sat significantly high off the ground. And but particularly visually, what you could see at the dam, it's astounding.
So water is 1,000 times denser than air. So when it comes on at you with force, it can cause a lot of damage. Just 6 inches of water can knock you off your feet, and a foot of water can carry your car. So imagine 20 25 feet of water. So it was massive.
Hi, am I on?
Yeah.
Yes, you are, Al.
We were trying to figure out how to get on because we couldn't get on with a computer. And so I missed the very beginning. And we're on with Dottie's iPad, but I have no idea how to use this. Not to tell too many tales about my age, but I remember the hurricane of 38. I was 4 years old at the time. So you can do some arithmetic, I guess. And my father drove up after it. We were in Massachusetts, and our relatives were up at Winnipesaukee. The camp was about 50 feet above the water, and the water from Winnipesaukee came up and licked at the doorway. So there was a huge fetch where they are from the south. Now, my recollection is that the storm moved at an incredible speed, so that since places like Winnipesaukee were on the eastern side, that meant you had the rotational speed of the storm plus the velocity of the storm coming up. So I heard numbers like 150 miles an hour or something for the winds just outside of the eye wall on that side. Is that about right?
So the hurricane made landfall with 120-mile-an-hour winds, but those are sustained winds. So when you take into account the topography, that sometimes the winds get channeled, the gusts could have been and were 150 plus in some areas. So yes, there could have been winds of 150 miles an hour, but not throughout the whole region.
Yeah.
When it passed through New England, mostly the sustained winds were about 50 miles an hour. But I mean, through New Hampshire. But local spots could have definitely had much stronger winds.
But I remember that the devastation was enormous. And it was scary for the folks who were up there. My grandmother and others in the camp, isolated on an island when this storm was taking place.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say it is 8:30. We'll stay on for a few more minutes, but I just want to thank everybody again for coming this evening. And if folks need to head off, we understand. It's such a great topic, though. I did want to say two things before anybody needs to leave. One is that Murray Movitz contacted me earlier this week and shared a short vignette, if you want to call it a vignette, of his experience in the storm. And so that will be under tonight's presentation once we post it as a recorded presentation. And that was, not to say obviously, but obviously I wasn't alive in 1938, and it's really amazing to imagine being right there, because many of us have been in incredible storms, but to imagine this particular storm is impressive. So thank you, Murray, for sharing that. So I will have that file shared for folks to look at, as well as Lourdes' link to her book, which you can purchase on Amazon. And I definitely recommend it. I mean, there are, again, as you shared, Lourdes, that there are a lot of publications about this particular event, and I'm familiar with a few of them. But again, not to monopolize the few minutes that we have for Lourdes' time, for those of us who live in New England and weren't alive, seeing the forest, there are signs of it out there, and that was one of the reasons I was really excited to hear your presentation tonight. So thank you very much. I'll give we'll give folks about 5 more minutes. We'll take a couple more questions, because I know that it's a great topic. So
if anybody has any pictures or anything they want to share with me, I have often added to the presentation items and stories that people have given me when I give presentations.
yeah.
I'm sure you've seen the pictures at the Common Man Inn in the lobby. Yeah.
How long, how long?
I
did
think
it
there's
take?
one about the flooding, and the other starts from the 1936 flood.
Yeah, and I know I'm only viewing the first screen, but I did see Murray, a hand up there. Go ahead, Murray.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I remember the hurricane vividly as I turned 4 the next day, September 22nd, and I wrote a story about that, which Leah will probably hand out. But I did want to mention that it was extremely vivid. That when I went outside, the wind was so strong it lifted me off my feet, carried me to the opposite side of the road, and there was debris and dust everywhere, and flying as a 4-year-old across the street was a wonderful experience. The next day I had a birthday, and when I made my wish and closed my eyes, all I could do was picture myself flying across the street. And the next day we observed fallen trees everywhere. And it was really quite devastating. And if you want to read my story, I think you'll find it kind of interesting.
I'd love
personal
to do that.
experience.
Yes. By the way, you all look really good for people that lived through the hurricane.
And on that note, Ray, if you unmute yourself, we can get to your question. And I apologize for those folks who I'm not catching, but let's go ahead and Ray, go ahead.
I was just wondering how it compared to the blizzard of '78.
Mm.
Yeah.
Both devastating events.
Yeah, right. Well, the blizzard paralyzed the whole area, but in a completely different way by being burned. No.
Was it a hurricane?
Yes, this was a hurricane. Oh, the blizzard of '78, you mean?
Yes.
Okay, so what the blizzard of '78 and other storms like that are, they are nor'easters. However, some of them have winds that are strong enough that could be similar to hurricanes, but they're not technically hurricanes because they're not tropical storms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lourdes, for joining us this morning. And we will have a few resources underneath Lourdes's recorded presentation for this evening. And we're so glad that all of you were able to join us. And we really appreciate you being here tonight, Lourdes, again, in kind of a short notice to fill a previously scheduled presenter. And there are a couple comments, so we'll make sure to try and catch them and respond. So again, thank you all so much for being
Thank you.
Thank you.
this evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
All right, and everyone have a good evening. Our next presenter will be Rich Rita in 2 weeks, who worked for the CIA for a number of years and has another very different political perspective on the environment. So thank you all again so much, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. All right. Thank you all again. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.